Hi everyone, in this video you are going to become a pro React developer. Yes, you are hearing it right. In this video I'm going to give you 5 pro tips to master React and take it to the next level. So if you're familiar with React, if you're just like a beginner or even an intermediate developer, just getting started with React, knowing the ecosystem, knowing this whole components ecosystem, the managing state, Redux store, and all that kind of stuff that are like, they might seem messy at first, but yet granted for you to learn a lot. So these pro tips, from my understanding, for a lot of people, like other pro and advanced developers who just use React in bigger projects, in industrial bigger projects, they just like offer and recommend these kind of tips. And also, as me, I work on a lot of like React projects. If you're familiar with my channel, I do a lot of React projects, so I got a chance to just take a look on what are those tips and what they can do for you if you just like take them right and just like master this kind of pro tips and just like use them to get into the next level with React. So if you're not familiar with React, hopefully you are because you're watching this video. So React is simply just a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And for those of you who are asking like why React is so popular, it's like so damn popular. Everyone is talking about React. I'm doing a lot of React components or a lot of React tutorials, and just like React is everywhere. Why is that? Basically, React is just like having this compositional declarative API where it allows you to use or reuse components, create them once, then reuse them everywhere. This is actually their slogan pretty much. And this is why React is so popular and so lovely. And yeah, the API is pretty great. It even allows you to actually create, like what React is based on is creating a virtual browser for you to work with that has an easier API to manage and like much better API, DOM API, virtual DOM API to work with, other than just like the real DOM that nobody pretty much likes and all this vanilla JavaScript. So that's basically why React is that. There's other opinions why React is super good, but that's basically the React website in here. And if you're familiar with React here, you're going to see the GitHub repository has 167 as of this video tutorial K stars. So that's ridiculous. Like the whole Facebook team pretty much maintaining that. So what you could get, anything other than that. So that's basically what React is. So what I'm going to give you is just basically those tips just to get started with. So here's actually I've got a project, pretty tidy project. I use create React app to create it. So the inside of this project, you're going to find it, by the way, in the link description below. You're going to find it in my GitHub repositories. So just go my GitHub account, you're going to find this. If you just like need them for a reference or anything, I'm just going to put them inside of like folders. So you could reference those and you can use them whenever you want or you want to learn something. So this pro tips, each folder in here contains a pro tip in here. And the reason I chose this one is actually to show you a demo and show you the code and show you actually exactly the differences between this and that, so you can exactly understand what the tip can do for you and what this kind of pattern or what this kind of technique, if you just like using your code, what it can do for you pretty much, and how it can just like improve your thinking pretty much, your React code, your React application, and all that kind of stuff. So that's basically what it is. What I'm going to be starting with is just actually the most basic stuff is functional components. So the first and the most important, like first pro tip, it's much more like an intermediate tip that a lot of people should already know. It's just basically why you should use functional components as of React 16.8. So if you're not familiar with functional components, it's actually pretty much the new feature that React introduces since 16.8 of React has been releases, and it's pretty much like it allows you to use state inside of functional component instead of going like and having to use classes for, just like using state. So functional components, or that's what I call the feature, is actually hooks. So in this particular like folder here, I got 2 like components. One uses classes and the other one uses functional component, and you got one for like doing the demo. So the class components is actually the legacy API for creating React components. So this is basically the first way, like what initially React was created and like put in public. This is actually how it was just like rendering into the DOM. So this was the only way to render to the DOM. So you have like a class component that extends the actual React components, which is a pure components pretty much, or a base component, they want to call it. And it just like it uses some state objects. It has to put props for super in here to be able to use it throughout the component. So you got the state in here. So this is where you keep up your state project or objects. So you should be familiar with that. And you got like the main render function or render method. So what it does, it pretty much just like renders the GSX in here, which is basically some HTML elements in here, renders them. You can have a text, you can interpolate some state in here just to render it out. And of course, we got some event handlers. So whenever we click on something, we're going to just delegate this into this method, which is going to update the state with this.setState, and it's going to update the counter with counter state counter +1. So that's just a basic component that what it does simply, just a counter component. So whenever you click on this counter ++ button, it's going to take the counter by 1. So it's going to keep going throughout plus and 1, 1, 1, 1, and yada yada yada. So that's basically what the legacy API is actually used by, class components to render in React. So for class component, they are still used like widely among developers, mainly because they have its own pros. So there's some scenarios you can't actually use functional components, so you have to fall back to class components. But anything other than that, my advice and the pro tip advice is actually just to ditch this code whenever you are actually doing something standard, like just like rendering, using the state, and just like updating the state, and just like making these components. Renders is kind of like particular elements and updating the data and the state, so on and so forth, with event listeners and all that kind of stuff. So in this case scenario, what you should go for is actually functional components instead of creating this class component. So if you're noticing in here, we got this whole class just to render up this particular divs with an H3 and a button. Then we can click on this button just to trigger up this this particular event in here to update the state. So the whole here is actually a huge class component, and pretty much has like a lot of lines of code to do that. Now what functional components actually offers for us, it's much simpler API to work with, plus a much simpler and cleaner code to look at. And of course, we can all go and use the sweetest thing, which is hooks. So hooks is basically here what it allows you actually to do is actually use state. So you remember class components, you got this like the way to do this .setState. For functional components, you basically you can use hooks. And I'm not gonna go like into beginner like 0 level stuff to teach you what is actually hooks, but I'm just saying that to actually understand exactly the difference between functional components and class components. So here we're using this, it basically offers us a state, so we can use this function to set a state, which is update the state, and the counter to like, gets the actual state value. And this one just like a function inside of a function, if you're familiar with pretty much closures in JavaScript. So that's basically a closure. You got this function that can be only defined inside of this function components or my function components. Then we can use that as actually an event listener, and we got everything pretty much the same by just like returning that, and that's it. So clearly, look how tight it is. We got it like, I don't know, we can say like a 10 lines of code versus a 20 lines of code in here. Boom, they can do the same thing, and without actually the complexity, because all we need actually to render up something that does the job, and we need an event listener, and we need to show up the counter, and we simply need a button. Just whenever we click it, it takes the counter by 1, and it keeps going and going and going. So that's basically what it does, and it's pretty straightforward. So a functional component in this case can be used much better. And why I'm saying functional component is actually much better than class component, because here you can actually separate this. If you have like a quite big, a large components, you can separate it into multiple functional components that can combine them together using some dumb components that you only use for rendering or stuff like that. And you basically got a much cleaner code than just having everything inside of a class component. That doesn't make sense pretty much. So that's the point of like why functional components are much better in terms of class components. If we take a look on that, if we go back to the React app in here, let me close both of these. So what we got is actually functional components. So this is the part of what it does. And the difference between those, they look identical. Just like from the first look, there is absolutely no difference, and it's the same. Pretty much the code is completely different, of course, but what it does and what it renders is pretty much the same. We got the same buttons. Whenever we click on that functional component, it does the same. We click on that too. It just like keeps increasing the counter, and there is totally no difference. So yeah, you can choose whatever you like, but still, I'm not saying functional component is actually the best way to go with that, because there are some case scenarios you have to use class components, like higher order components, or using some other patterns that require you to use class components. But anything other than that, yeah, functional components are the best way to go for that particular case scenario. The second pro tip that pretty much everyone that uses React, every React developer should know about and every React developer should use is actually do not use array map index. If you're not familiar with that, it's basically whenever you have a list and you are actually gonna loop through our list using like an array.map, then you render up every single item on that list, you have to provide a key to React for it to actually be able to know and differentiate between which child has changed, which one has updated, which one has not. So you could every single time you can run the reconciliation algorithm and you can pretty much tell which child to re-render and which just to keep that, because that's for performance reasons, and you have to know exactly which child changed or which doesn't. So it pretty much knows which one to re-render or which one just to keep it on the tree there, so it doesn't have to do like a full tree re-rendering. So for the no map index in here, if we take a look on the pretty much the way that we do it, always, like every single developer goes through this, is actually using the index. Exclusively here we got stars. And by the way, just like a quick notice, I'm using Typescript in here. Why? Because also I got like a tip for Typescript in here. So I have to like tell you exactly why I'm using Typescript in here and why you should actually start using Typescript if you are just getting started with a project, or you can integrate and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, so here we got like a stars array that holds a couple of objects. Each one holds a star name. And those actually just like, stars in our galaxy, I guess. I'm not sure. So Polaris, Cyrus, and all that kind of stuff. And we got like, this is an interface, just TypeScript. If you don't know TypeScript perfectly, just ignore that. Just never mind about this. And the map index components in here, what it does, it has a UL. So it has an ordered list. And we are looping inside of like stars.map, and every single time we are rendering the LI. And that's pretty normal, right? We just like doing a map and rendering. Cool. Everything sounds good. The dangerous part in here is actually using or assigning to the key the array index. And in fact, this one is going to be like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, like depending on the number of items you've got inside of like the stars array, right? So the part in here is we are actually assigning those to the key. And as I told you before, the key is actually used by React to tell which component has changed and which hasn't. And in that case, it has to be a unique key only assigned to that particular component. What I mean by the unique key, it has to be generated for that particular component. For example, for this object, it has to be generated like a specific key for it, like an ID. If you think of it like a database ID that can be generated for that particular one, it can be put inside of this object, and it can be used later on for the key to identify that particular object or that particular star, whatever you want to call it. So that's the reason. But in this one, it's going to always be the same. It's always going to be start from 0 up. And if you like got an application that changes pretty much, for example, the order, if you got like, drag and drop and you can change the order of the items and all that kind of stuff, you're going to become messy, and React won't be able to know which one to update, and that's where you start getting bugs and all that kind of stuff. Now, for this code, it will work perfectly. You won't notice any stuff, no update or no issues, whatever. But if you start putting other like code and side effects, some vanilla JavaScript into it, you're going to start noticing that React is not updating the state, or pretty much not updating and re-rendering the list as expected to be. So that's pretty much the point, and that's what I'm telling. So do not use index in here as a key unless you're knowing what to do. But anything other than that, any other case scenario, just do not go for this and use the other way around. Now the next one, what you should go through is actually using a unique ID. Exclusive here for the interface star, we got an ID belonging to this, but it's actually like an optional one, so you don't care about it. Now the stars we get into, so let's assume you're getting this from an API, from our server or something, and the name only exists there. It doesn't have any unique ID from the database, unfortunately, so we can't use that. Now what we can go through is actually we can go and generate a unique name for it, and we can like assign it so we can have this unique name. And what I'm using for this one, I'm using a nano ID. So nano ID is actually a package that allows you to generate like unique IDs that, I guess, if I remember right, I guess yeah, there are 21 symbols and symbols, sorry, and you can pretty much manipulate that using configuration, and that's what it perfectly generates. It's pretty much like a new ID, but it's much more friendly to the API and it's easier to use. So yeah, it kind of like uses dates to just generate these random things. Now this random key can be used an ID for that particular star. Now what I'm doing in here is actually I'm having a function. Inside of this like function or method, we got new stars. We are looping through each star in here. What we're doing, we're using the same stars properties, but we are actually assigning a new property called ID, and we are using nano ID to generate that. So this nano ID is going to return something like this. So it's going to return a unique ID for that particular star. For example, Polaris is going to have a unique ID different than Sirius and all the other stars. So that's basically what's going to happen in here. We're going to have every single one that has a unique ID, and all of them going to be put inside of the data structure. Do not use this like outside. Like here, you can pretty much do something like ID, like nano ID, and every single time you're going to use this ID, because why? Basically, this one is going to every single time on every single render. Remember, React runs this on every single render, so it's going to run it a couple of times, and every single time you're going to have like a new ID, and this new ID you're going to just like assign it in here, and React will tell, oh, the key changed, so I guess I have to update the whole tree, and it's going to update the whole tree even though nothing has changed. So in that case, you're going to like drastically lower the performance down. You're going to see a lot of performance issues. So don't do this. This is bad, really bad. So just go through this approach. You can have in this one, you can set prepared stars, you assign them onto a state. Then it's from this state, screws in here what we are running. This method is being run only once. So use effects is being run only once, which means on component did mount. After the component is mounted, this one runs only once, and it prepares that, it puts it inside of this state. Now later on, what we can do, just go loop through into the stars. In fact, I'm not doing this right. There's a bug, but yeah, just loop through prepared stars.map. You grab the star, then all you have to do is just like the star.id, and there you go. So it's like we're putting this particular unique ID on the key. Now each item in here, each LI has a unique ID, and in fact, that's a much better than just using no index map. So hopefully guys, you got the point why you don't need to do that, and you must not do that. So this is actually the example I'm talking about. So as clearly see, they are pretty identical. There's totally no difference. You can't tell because a viewer and user can't tell that. But performance and issues and expected bugs, they come up if you just keep using the old approach that is pretty not good, okay? Just don't go through this. So if I show you this one, I guess if I go to unique ID, it's clearly in here for the state of this, for the unique ID index, which is, you know, the preferred state, the pro tip, whatever you want to call it. Take a look on the state. There you go. So we got an ID. Every single one clearly has a unique ID that is different than the others, which is pretty great. Now it's being used as a unique ID. Now if we take a look on the other one, the map index, take a look on it. Yeah, we don't have a state in here, but yeah, you can tell that this particular one, this app index demo, what it does have is just basically 0. This one's going to be assigned a key of 0, 1, 2, 3, so on and so forth. So I hope you guys got the point why you should not do that. And by the way, nano IDs here, you can go ahead and check it out. The third pro tip that a lot of people tend just to don't use is actually error boundaries. So error boundaries is actually like a React feature that allows you to use it as a try catch. If you're familiar with JavaScript, try catch, where you have got this block that you can throw anything at it, then you got later a catch method that catches anything goes or throw inside of that pretty much block. That's pretty much the same thing. So this one, it's not being used by imperative code that you can use with JavaScript. Now this one is going to be used by declarative, and in fact it's going to be used with React components indeed. So error boundaries here allows you to actually catch whatever is being thrown inside of React components. And why this one has been introduced, why can't you use like a try catch normally? Basically because everything in React, all the rendering, all the kind of stuff, and state manipulation is actually asynchronous. So you have something asynchronous to handle it properly, other than synchronous, of course. So for error boundaries in here, if you take a look on the error boundary, so this is basically the API that allows us to pretty much like create an error boundary. So all we use to import React, we got my error boundary. All they basically do, just a normal React component. And this is the case what I was talking about before, that you can use a functional component. This one, for an error boundary, you have to use a class component. So it's basically a normal component, has a constructor, has a render method. But the most important part to notice about error boundaries is actually you have to implement either one of these methods in order to be able to tell that this one is an error boundary. In fact, this won't work as an error boundary unless you just like specify or you define either one of these or both of them. So this one is a static method. It's called getDerivedState from error. What it does, it just pretty much gets you a state that this state is going to be updated with this state object. Pretty much this object is going to update with whatever we return from here. And in fact, this one is going to have the error object in here is going to be thrown somewhere inside of the components. So this is what we get it. And what I'm doing, just putting has error to true and message error and error.message. So whatever message comes through the error, we just put it inside of that state. So the state later on can have the has error to be set to true and the actual message we got from the error. Pretty cool. Now the component did catch what it does. So whenever it catches an error, so it did catch an error, you're going to get the error object and error info, and you can just like log it or whatever. So this one is kind of like not mandatory. You can remove it. I'm going to keep it for now. And you can just like log it to your service. You can send it to a server as an application crash or whatever. So this one is pretty great for like developer and debugging and all that kind of stuff. And this one changes the states and handles it properly. Now, the other part is actually the render method. Now, the render method, what it does, you have to do something. So this one is actually mandatory. You have in a normal way, like whenever there is no errors, which means has errors to be false. And what you could do, just like return the children, because how error boundaries work is actually have this error boundary as the parent component. Then whatever comes inside of it as a children, then this is where it could catch the errors. You can't catch all the components that are outside of the error boundary. In fact, it has to be inside, it has to be a child of it, okay? And in fact, this one is just basically renders normally the children. And in other states, if there's an error, all we do is just like render up an error text, and we use the state.message, and remember we put that in here, and we can get it right. So that's basically what it does. It handles the errors. You can imagine it as like try catch. Whenever you catch it, you're gonna just like render up the error. Now, let's just go through an example. We got a pretty basic example in here. All it does, you got like some splash up, and we are wrapping this image view with my error boundary. So this image view is just a basic component. All it does, it renders like an image showcase, and it renders an image with an SRC, and it expects this SRC to come from the props. Now what I'm doing in here is actually, if no SRC, I'm just gonna throw a new error with this silly error message or whatever. So that's the case. That's the case why error boundaries are super helpful. And in fact, this one is actually a child. So my error boundary, the image view, is a child of error boundary. So this error boundary is going to handle this child. So if you throw it outside of this error boundary, it doesn't care about it, it won't handle it, and it won't even know about it, okay? So it has to be a child there, and it has to know about it. So we can go ahead and do that. We'll click save, we go back. So you see, in fact, I just like refreshed that and we got the error already. This is not the error you want in, of course, but this one is only just here because we are in development. So this one is being showed up because we are in development, but if the app is in production, it's not going to show that. This is just a developer friendly debugging is green. So let's go with it, rid of it, and that's what should be shown on a production screen to a real world user. So we got no image SRC found. In fact, this one, take a look on the error boundary. This one is actually the message that we throw from that image view, exclusive image source found. And in fact, we are actually rendering inside of this error text, which has some color and font size and all that kind of stuff. So the error boundary is doing a really great job and it's catching that. And if the SRC is not found or something, just like catch it, it handles it properly, and it renders the proper UI. So that's why error boundaries are meant. So it could save you a lot of work with error boundaries, just like define a single error boundary that takes care of it all, and wherever there is an error, a thrown or something like that, it can handle it properly, and it can catch it, and it can render up the made up or the actual perfect UI for it to handle this particular error. So error boundaries are the way to go. The fourth pro tip is actually style component. I know this is more like an opinionated, much more personal choice to go through, but I find most of like CSS in JS libraries are much better than using CSS modules or just like putting CSS strictly into the DOM or the style, attribute and all kind of stuff. It's actually the best way to go with or alongside React. I'm just saying alongside React, I'm not talking about other scenarios or other libraries or whatever that kind of stuff. Okay, so style components, if you're not familiar with it, it's actually a CSS in JS library that allows you to put or create or put CSS inside of like components that you can use them as like a component, as a React component, then render them inside of like main or app components or whatever kind of that stuff. Okay, so that's basically what style components are. And if you take a look on these, so this is the regular CSS component that you would use, and it's actually a regular CSS module. So you see I'm importing the styles from style.module.scss. If you take a look on this, it's just basically having that. It has a container, it has an image container, and it has an image, and they just like a basic CSS classes. And in fact, I'm using Sass in here, so clearly see the extension. So in fact, I'm importing these styles, then I can do styles.container, styles.imageContainer. So whatever the class names you're using, you can reuse them as a class names there, and that's it. So this is the old way of defining that kind of stuff, and it's actually working perfect. It works perfect, it works as charm. You got your CSS in here, it's gonna be applied throughout classes, to whatever divs in here. But the only bad thing, and it's a huge thing, if you work with both of these, and you're going to find like a huge difference between both of these, that this one lacks a lot of like info, a lot of readability, and you literally can't read through that. If you take a look in here, we got a class name, but we don't know what this class name is. We know that's a container, yeah, okay. But we don't know exactly what the container goes to. We have to go to the other file, and CSS could be really ugly and really complicated, so you have to look exactly for the class name. What is the class name? You have to know the nested child and all that kind of stuff. It becomes really boring, right? So you got the container, you got the image container, and here you have to look for all of them, but you don't know exactly which one is a component, and you don't know the name of that. Even the most bad or the worst part in here is actually you can't pass in. So for example, you got some like a color value inside of this component that you need to pass in into like the container. Then the container can use this as like, for example, a background color. Then it can set whatever background color. You can't do that using CSS modules, and in fact that's pretty horrible. But the other alternative that I find the most and the best combination of CSS with React plus JavaScript is actually using style components. If you take a look on the other hand, the style components, it's pretty awesome in here. If you take a look on the file, it has pretty much all the CSS, all the React components, and the rendering or the main rendering components, everything you pretty much need to maintain, read through the code, and exactly understand what the code does. Just in brief, just taking a look on that, what is going on. So with this container, we got styled, and styled in here has pretty much everything from an HTML element. So all HTML elements exist here, like an A, hyperlink, animate, area, you got span, you got div, pretty much anything you would think of that. So this one's going to create a div for us. So the container here is going to be a div React component that going to be having this CSS style is going to be applied into it. And what is better is actually you've got this one. So whatever you put in here is going to be CSS. In fact, it's going to be a Sass. It's not normal regular CSS. You can have it even to use Sass, kind of like, functions, mixins, and all that kind of stuff. And it looks absolutely amazing. It's going to help you a lot. So here one got image container, has everything that you need. Then all you have to do, just put container, image container. Then if you've got an image, you can put it there. And it's pretty simple, like straight to the point. The code is pretty readable, and you're not going to find a lot of complexities reading through the code and even maintaining it, because you know exactly what is going on. You got the styles in here to manage. And in fact, if you need to pass in something into it, for example, you can say you want to submit a color, and let's say this color is going to be white. So for this one, we need the background color. So, we want to grab the background color of the container. How we can do that? So in fact, like styled components handles that, and we can use this syntax, which is like string literal syntax from ES6, and we can grab in the color. Then we can have a callback function, and the function can return pretty much whatever. Now this color is going to be applied to a background color, and we're going to have it right, and it would work right. How cool is that? That is going to be absolutely amazing. It's going to help you a lot. So let's take into the demo, and screw this in here. I'm rendering CSS component, I'm rendering style component. I'm literally not finding any differences in terms of styles, rendering, even though from the elements perspective, take a look here, there is totally no difference in image, div, another div. Then if you take a look on the style components parts, yeah, pretty much the same. They all have this ugly classes that you can't read through, while style component likely has a feature that allows you to make those readable. But still, yeah, no difference, nothing like that. It's all about code, and it's all about actually having clean code. And if you're not familiar with clean code, you should start actually addressing and putting your mind into like making your code look cleaner and much better, and just like write code for others, not only for yourself. The last tip is actually TypeScript. So yes, you are hearing right. TypeScript is making it out to like 2020, 2021, 2022, and whatever comes next. TypeScript is actually the next level of JavaScript. If you never tried to work with TypeScript or never take like a even quick sneak look into how TypeScript looks like, it's basically JavaScript. It just literally everything is similar to JavaScript, other than all is being added. From its name, there is a type, so there is statically typed JavaScript code in there. So you can use pretty much familiar with C, C++. You can use types like integers, ints, or booleans, and you can use numbers, floats, all that kind of stuff. You can even create your own types. And there's a lot of other stuff that's derives from this stuff, derives from the types into themselves. And there's a lot of features going to TypeScript that makes it super, super tidy and super perfect. So let's take a look on like what the JavaScript components would look like, just as simple components. So we got like a fruit list, we got an array of that, then we got a functional component that has a message going to be like arriving from the props. In fact, since this message is arriving from the props, we don't know what is the type of the message is, right? It's just arriving, so we just like assume, oh, the message would be a string. But we have to look into like what the parent component is going to be passed through, so we can exactly tell what the message is. Now we got the selected fruit, we got set for selected fruit for the setting state, a function to update that state, and the render in here is pretty basic. We got either render message or yum you like, and we got selected fruit, so for the selected fruit orange or apple or coconut, and we got like which fruit you like. So this one is going to be asks if there is no selected fruit. Then we got simply just like render up a list of fruits list.map, and we got fruit and index, and we can select up the fruit, and we pass in the index. Let's clear this in here. Another bad stuff in here, but I'm not caring about that because this is purely just to go ahead and demonstrate the difference between JavaScript and TypeScript components, right? So that's basically what JavaScript components looks pretty great, right? But it's not really that good because the code is not readable. If I'm not the person who wrote that, and if the code is much more complicated than that, I'm going to have a really hard time understanding exactly what's going on in here, what the context is, what the variables means, and what the types of the variables are. For example, this selected fruit, I have to look, selected fruit, I have to go, selected fruit, this one is null. So fruits list, for example, this one is actually on the API. That's going to cause a lot of other issues. You don't know what the API is going to come back with, right? So you're not going to tell this one is a string, but right now here, you can straight tell, this one is a string. We've got a string in here that's going to be passed in either string or null, and this one is going to be a string. So fruits list, what is fruits list? It's an array, right? So we're mapping through it. So what is a fruit? An object or a string? You can't tell, right? You can here in our case scenario, but let's say it's doing an API call. You're going to have a hard time telling what that guy is. So you have to take a look on it, and you have to do a lot of other stuff that makes it look ugly, and it's gonna take you a lot of time, even though it might seem simple at first. But if the code is complicated and you got like hundreds of lines of code and hundreds of components nested together, you're gonna find a really bad time debugging, especially if you have a bug or an issue in your code. So yeah, you're gonna find a lot of problems on that. On the other hand, take a look on Typescript. So what's going on? So we got here JavaScript components props. This one is pretty simple, right? So I got JavaScript components props. This one in fact is an interface, and it's giving it a message. So this interface should have a message, and it's not actually like, you know, a needed message, which means it's not a required message, just basically an optional message, and it tells it the type right away. It's a string type. So we pass in this, so the props is gonna have a message, so we can tell right away that this one should be a string or undefined. Cool, right? Let's move forward. The state should have a string or null, and the initial state has a null. Pretty straightforward, right? Pretty self-explanatory. If I go back here, selected fruit, oh, what the fruit could be, right? Take a look in the parameters, you got fruit, oh, it has a string. Cool. So we selected fruit, we're passing this string, and even though we take a look on the value in here, the value accepts either string or null because it has the declaration types in there, so it does the job, and IntoLicense got us that from VS Code. Thanks, VS Code. Another one. So jump into the rendering part, we got selected fruit. Sweet, right? So selected fruit, take a look on it. This one is either a string or null. If you have this one in the lines of like the 1000th line, you're pretty much not gonna go scroll all the way up to the first line and take a look on what the type is actually. Just like hover over it, you got the type. Pretty sweet. We got another message. The message is actually a string or undefined. So if this one is defined, they're gonna do this one. Otherwise, you're gonna show the selected fruit. Okay, cool. So we got which fruit you like. Then here, this one is a list. This list has a string, right? It's a string array. And you can even define that. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I don't want to define this like this. You could, and it could make it much easier to read through, actually. So we got fruits list, we got string array here. We're going to map through this. We got fruits. So the fruit, what is going to be a fruit? A fruit is going to be simply a string, right? We're going to render up this. This function is defined up there. You got the key in here is going to be an index, an ember. Pretty sweet. Like, you could easily read through that, just like even with a single eye, you can just go through the code and know exactly which variable is, what is the type of a variable, from where that variable came. Just like with adding just a teeny tiny things, like here we added this simple interface, you can have another interface that defines pretty much the state. If you got Redux or anything kind of stuff like that, you can have another state defining what the Redux store has, like what the properties that they are existing there, and pretty much the type of those properties, and boom, you got yourself a really nice tidy code, pretty clean code, and everything is pretty tidy and made up together to exactly tell what is going on in there. So that's basically the difference between using pure JavaScript and using TypeScript. So you just might spend a little bit more time to learn TypeScript, but you can always fall back to JavaScript if you know, or pretty much you don't want to use TypeScript anyway. You can fall back, even though the code is clear and it can be a hybrid code. They could both exist at the same word. So JavaScript can exist alongside pretty much TypeScript without any issues or worries. So yeah, that's basically the last tip, and hope you guys pretty much enjoyed this. I know I talked a lot. I just like trying to just give a point about these particular tips because they are very important. I wish I knew this when I started as a React. I was just doing all the kind of horrible stuff that made me realize, oh, this is the worst and this is the way I should do it from now on my bigger projects, on my work, or my pretty much personal project, open source, tutorials, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this one. As I said before, if you like kind of this type of video tutorials, let me know. I love making React. I love making this kind of stuff. I love sharing my knowledge, and I love sharing this kind of tips for you guys just to grow stronger and stronger from your side. So I think that's what I said before. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and yeah, catch you all hopefully in the next ones.